You've entered BOOKSTORM with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Welcome back, book lovers. We are very excited because we have a repeat author with us here today, coming all the way from the UK. Welcome, Alex Hay. So happy to have you back again.
Thank you so much. I am beyond thrilled to be back here. Thank you.
And we're very happy that you have another book out. I'm going to show the cover for our YouTube. It's The Queen of Fives. I absolutely adored it. So did Kristen. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about this one. But before I get started, let me tell our listeners a little bit about you. So you grew up in Cambridge and Cardiff in the UK, and you've been in writing as long as you can remember. As a child?
Absolutely. Yeah. From, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 in pencil in the back of exercise books. So you're spot on.
I love that. That's a gift, and that's your passion, and you're meant to be doing it. That's obvious. You studied history, of all things, at the University of York, which plays into some of the stories. You've worked in magazine publishing and in the charity sector. Thank you for that. And I think it's pretty cool that you took a course at Curtis Brown, Write Your Novel. I'm a graduate of that course, which is very prestigious, so I hear. Now, you were here with us first for The Housekeepers. It was your debut novel. It won the Caledonia Novel Award. And now, of course, we're here to talk about The Queen of Fives. We're very excited. You're living in the UK still with your hubby. And we are just thrilled that you've come so far across the Atlantic to speak with us today. It's very exciting when we have authors from different parts of the world. And welcome back. Can't wait to talk about this great book.
Thank you. Thrilled.
Alex, you might remember from last time that I like to give our listeners a bit of the background of what's going on in the story, and I won't give away any spoilers. And if you want to add anything, please, be our guest to do so. But here, as Chris mentioned, I want to show this cool cover again. We're talking about the Queen of Fives. And in this story, we're transported to 1898 London. And right off the bat, we encounter Queen LeBlanc. Now, she is the reigning queen over the Chateau, which is basically, I love how you described it, an elective monarchy of cons, people who came together because they are running these confidence games, but high stakes. And in this situation, she is getting ready to pull off a very audacious con. She is thinking that she's going to trick an eligible duke into marriage and then maybe run off with the family fortune. Now, she pulls it off for a time. She enters society as a debutante. She is, apparently very wealthy, and she enmeshes herself into the lives and even into the home of the Kendall family. They are a bit reclusive, but what she doesn't understand fully is that they have lies and deceit and deceptions of their own. And pretty soon she is locked into this web of, I want to say love and loyalty and deception, of course. Do you want to add anything to that backdrop?
No, Kristen, as ever, I'm scrunching in and loving your description of the plot. You do it so well. I think that was perfect.
Awesome.
Yes, and you wrote it so well, and our listeners are going to love this juicy little story. I really enjoyed Quinn. She was the current Queen of Fives. She was the master of deception and manipulation. But as a student, Mrs. Arley warned her, Quinn, you lack foresight. You operate here, pointing to the heart. But then Mrs. Arley pointed to her brain. This is where your finest machinery is located. But then Quinn replied, I'm not a machine at all. We rooted for Quinn throughout the story. And I had to ask you, as the creator of Quinn, is this why? Because she was willing to think a little bit more with her heart. we didn't just see her on a quest to win. Maybe it was a weakness, but we grew to love her because of it.
Great question. And I think you are spot on. And certainly for me, writing Quinn, who is my reigning Queen of Fives, famed for her ability to lift a man's fortune with 5 moves in 5 days, who has been carefully and precisely educated in the academy that you just mentioned in that quote. She's grown up with the artistry of the con sort of in her blood. But what I found when researching real life confidence schemes and swindles of the 19th century is after a while, you kind of go, well, so what? What's the point? And I think for me, trying to find a way for Quinn to have a certain morality to what she was doing and a code of conduct to operate by suddenly gave all of her games so much more resonance for me and was so much more satisfying to launch off on into writing. And I think the other question I was asking myself was, well, what's it like to be 26, ferociously well educated, with an entire court in your household in Spitalfields to provide you with all the costumes and tricks required to shift skins as easily as breathing? What's the joy of that? But what's the cost as well? And actually, what happens when you start bumping up against yourself, your real self, even while you're in disguise? And so all of that was sort of mixing around in my mind when sort of discovering Quinn and discovering her game. And I'm glad to hear you say she has a heart, because I agree and I love her. And I think that's at the root of the story. Her quest to do what she thinks is right, and whatever the cost, kept the pages typing along for me, and I hope turning for you. So hooray.
Yes, and I loved some of the rules in the rule book. One in particular, that her mark must be of immoral character. And that added a little twist to it, a little bit of a Robin Hood twist, that not only am I conning someone, but I may be getting revenge that someone else deserves, and I may be doing a little good for society as a whole.
I agree. I mean, you and I should set up our con artistry business together, because I think you are quite right. That's the way to do it. I mean, I adored creating Quinn's rulebook, and in fact, creating her whole household. So the chateau that you mentioned, tucked away in Spitalfields, relies on this code of conduct to not just keep its jobs running smoothly, but to give meaning to all of the people who operate within that household, and designing the sort of art of those 5 moves and their very precise steps, almost like a dance that the con artist would follow, was so satisfying for me, because it was great fun in the background to write the sort of waspish, slightly censorious voice of the original author of the rule book, who is very, very clear on what's okay and what is not. But of course, Quinn knows that she'll take and adapt any elements of the rule book to do what she thinks is right, sometimes to her own peril. So yeah, loved that.
Me too.
Alex, I want to dive into that a little deeper, because the house in Spitalfields, the Chateau, was described as a humble old house. And on the outside, it blended into the neighborhood and it didn't call attention to itself. But on the inside, as you mentioned, there were these intricate rules and even intricate rooms to keep it all running smoothly, the whole con. And I wanted to ask you if that was maybe a metaphor for Victorian society. Is it a metaphor for running a con?
Oh, that's a very astute question. And I think you're spot on that there's something about the rigidity of Victorian codes of conduct that are translated into the chateau and the way the chateau operates. And I think beyond that as well, I was sort of imagining Quinn is the queen of her court, and courts rely on ceremony in order to function. And within that ceremony, the courtiers understand why they're there and what they're trying to achieve, and closeness to the crown and influence is everything. And the rule book was sort of, I suppose, inspired by 2 things. First of all, some of the true tricks of a confidence scheme, but also thinking about some of those, and you mentioned at the start that I did a history degree many, many moons ago, thinking about some of those big, hefty volumes of rules and ceremonial that used to underpin life at a royal court. I loved the idea that the Queen of Fives, the original Queen of Fives, whoever she was, when she landed in Spitalfields in the 1790s and established her court in this criminal underworld, would have enshrined all of the behaviors of her courtiers within this book, and would have set out very clearly for them, here's how we do it, and here's why it matters. So that for me, I suppose, was as much a sort of symbol of the period, as you rightly say, but also just me having a very delicious time trying to give structure and framework to the game. But also, I suppose, the thing I would add was there was a bit of a plot imperative there, which was what I really enjoyed setting off on this book was the idea that, to your point earlier, Kristen, the stakes are quite high. How is it possible that Quinn LeBlanc can choose to target the wealthiest and most powerful family in Mayfair and defraud them within just 5 days? How is she going to do 5 moves in 5 days at that level? And how is she going to use every tool in her toolbox and really dig deep into the core codes of the rule book to pull that off? So that's where all of that I think was coming from.
Yeah, that was really cool. And I'll tell you, I also saw an allegory in the natural world, and that is the idea of a beehive, where on the outside, we don't necessarily see the intricate rules, all to keep the queen running and to keep her alive and to keep her, in charge. So I thought that was really
so
deep.
true. So true. I think I screamed last time, "Are you in my brain?" And the last time we spoke, and I need to scream it again. You are so spot on. You're spot on. And I love actually the idea of the honeycomb and all these different sections being held together. And as you rightly say, just the protection of the queen at the very center of it all. But all those workers are doing their own piece in the puzzle is so, so key. But of course, within this book, as within the Hive, when some of those players start to go off in their own directions, or when we suspect that there's somebody else rivaling the queen for her own supremacy, all hell breaks loose. So you are spot on, as ever.
I love that. I also loved all the secrets in this book. There was a quote that I wrote down. Life was a puzzle box. It was made up of innumerable little drawers, some locked, some not, with glinting clasps and metal teeth. The reader understood that almost every character had a secret past, secret desires, secret hopes, including the entire Kendall family. And I had to ask, as the author, why were some secrets their strength, but others seemed to be their downfall? And at one point, the reader was very aware that maybe we're not always honest with ourselves in life.
Well, I love that you've pulled out that quote. Thank you. It was a sort of treat to me when writing the book to structurally think about it almost like my own Victorian puzzle box, this sort of veneered, cleverly layered, cunningly constructed boxes full of secret drawers, and to sort of have that in my mind almost as a sort of symbol of how I wanted the plot to operate, because it is quite layered. And I think the thing about secrets, I suppose, is it sort of could go either way, couldn't it, to answer your question? So if you reveal yourself to somebody you trust and you give your secret away, you could be set free. And there are certain characters in this story, without giving anything away, who have disclosed hidden sides and dimensions of themselves to others. And in some cases, they're rewarded for it, and in some cases, they're deeply betrayed. And so I think that's the ultimate risk, isn't it? Because humans are humans, and some secrets are better kept for the sake of safety. But I think to sort of fully answer your question as well, I think there's sort of levels we all have to deal with, and the characters in this book are dealing with of their lives. We've got people who are rich but don't feel free, characters who are high in status but very low in safety. And so within those contradictions, they're having to hold back pieces of themselves in order to protect themselves, but also, of course, sometimes to gain the upper hand. And what I really enjoyed in this book was the idea of not just my con artist, but her marks as well, constantly flipping not just their identities, but also their roles within the story, so that they could play with, trick, and flip each other. either to protect themselves or protect others. And I will tell you truthfully, writing the book, which I really embarked on, feeling forced to throw in my plan, was as much a case of sort of detective work for me, of working out, okay, well, who can I trust here? And who is telling the truth? And I didn't really know until the latter stages of finishing and writing the book who I could really count on. And I hope the reader has that slight sense of anticipation too, going through the story.
Very much so. And I loved that Quinn was filled with secrets and disguises, but Mr. Silk was loyal to Quinn, seemingly very loyal. And so she had one person who she could share her secrets with, and he was a great character.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned Mr. Silk. I loved Mr. Silk. Do you know, in the first draft, Mr. Silk was called something else. He was very dense, very dry, just a very difficult person. And I really detested writing him. And that was probably when I had about 10,000 words. And I thought, this is not working. This guy's miserable. And chucked it away and sort of started again. And Mr. Silk appeared very organically. And I can really see him with his sort of shining bald head and his very punctilious outfit, and his constant paranoia and his longing to be able to still get a very economical slice of roast beef on Beak Street. I really felt him, and as a sort of compatriot to Quinn, who is so much younger than him and so different, and her energy is so much more dynamic and keen to take risks than him. I just loved seeing them play off against each other. And in some ways, I think he's very much the heart of the book. And he and Mrs. Airley, who you mentioned at the beginning, who was Quinn's tutor at the academy, again was somebody who, on the surface, is extremely rigid and has almost absorbed the rule book and implements its rules so firmly, but has a hidden dimension, and her own vulnerabilities and her own love for Quinn as well. So just building that chosen family within the chateau, bound not just by the rules at the end of the day, but by their love for each other and what they do, was such a joy to create.
Mm-hmm. Loved it.
Alex, I want to ask you about something else. One of the rules in the Chateau's rule book was this. I'm going to quote it. Prolonged deception rotted the soul. Now, the writer of that knew that well. And I wanted to ask you if at any point in a deceptive scheme, does a deceiver need to convince herself of the lies that she is telling? How does she deal with that internal dissonance?
Ooh, the cognitive dissonance of fraud. Oh, what a wonderful question. I mean, having not committed any huge long cons myself, I can only speculate. But I think what I was trying to get at in that line was the idea that the original Queen of Fives deliberately sets a time limit on the length of a con. It cannot go on any longer than 5 days, because if you keep pretending to be someone else, eventually you'll sort of lose the real you, and then you're lost. And I was thinking a little bit about, I don't know if you've ever heard those stories of soap opera actors who are in it for so many decades that they just sort of become their character and they're gone. And I think that's really interesting, actually, that if you act long enough, you do sort of warp your reality. And I think that's really what the rule in the rule book is sort of trying to ward against. But your question, which is, do we all need to deal with dissonance internally, is a really wise one. And I suppose we do, don't we? Because as we look around ourselves in our world and see contrary opinions or injustice or things that we would like to right that we think are wrong, we inevitably have to work out whether we're right or someone else is incorrect, or whether we've got it upside down ourselves. And I can see the characters in this story who are at a kind of anxious point in their history, who are still wrapped up in all the textures and tones of the 19th century and high Victoriana, but are feeling the anxiety of a new century coming, and are trying to work out what their place in it might be. They are, I suppose, trying to pass their own judgments internally to make sure that they're doing the right thing and making the right choices, as we all do. So I suppose that need to constantly interrogate yourself is eternal.
Yeah. I can see where, the rule book functioned as almost a moral code. And it was making me think about the fact that is having a moral code in and of itself enough? Or does that moral code have to also be true and right?
Well,
Right?
I
Is it
think, yeah,
enough?
yeah, yeah. I think that's such a great question. I mean, I suppose ultimately it's not enough, is it? Because as much as I loved writing the rule book, at the end of the day, it is fraud. It's rules to help you lie and tell those lies successfully and do so in an artful and interesting and elegant way towards people the rule book deems worthy of that fraud. But it is still a trick. And so I think there's a moral question there, which the characters in the book have to ask, which is what is the point? And are we doing the right thing or not? And I really enjoyed that. And I think, it's also worth bearing in mind that I've deliberately situated this novel in towards the end of the 19th century and have played on some of the tropes of late Victorian sensation fiction that I so adore. So the sort of doubleness and degeneracy and illicit desire that you find in everything from The Woman in White to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, all of those tropes of doubleness, all for very urgent and difficult, and people are trying to work out what's the right way to live and order our society. And I suppose the chateau in its sort of humble way is part of that whole bigger project. So yeah, a moral conundrum for me that I shall have to ponder further.
Well, we just absolutely loved this story, The Queen of Fives. And you put so much thought into, not just the history and the motivations, but, really the thrill and the fun of it that comes across loud and clear. And of course, in this discussion, it came across loud and clear. But that's why these books are so entertaining as well as thought provoking. I love it.
Thank you.
Before we let you go, Alex, can you share a little bit about maybe what you're working on next? Maybe just a clue?
Yes, so I am writing book three at the moment, which is in still fairly early stages. But what I will say is, I think for me, the core story I will always want to write is a big house and a bad family. And both the housekeepers and the Queen of Fives sort of play with that theme. And I would be lying if I didn't say I think book three has, again, a very big, opulent building and a very complicated cast thrown together within it. And many a perilous mystery shall there unfold. But I suppose that's all I can say for now.
That's enough. We look forward to it. And we obviously
Thank
hope you
you.
come back on our show. We love having you.
Love
I
it.
adore being here. You know, I love this
Love it.
podcast so much, and it's so wonderful to see how many more people are finding the bookstore all the time. So, hooray!
Yes.
Yay.
And I'm going to tell our listeners too how to get in touch with you. You have a wonderful website. They can find you at alexheybooks.com. You've got a newsletter. You're on Instagram, on X. And, again, I hope they do contact you. I hope that they pick up this book. I know they will. We think it's going to be a great seller. And thank you again.
Thanks, Alex. So good to see
Thank
you
you so
again.
much. So good to see you both. All the best for now. Bye.
Bye-bye. It's so great to see Alex Hay again, all the way in the UK. And I just love his books. It reminds me a lot of these big Netflix series that are going on right now. We're talking about the history and the Victorian times and everything that was going on in England. And we're sort of infatuated with this right now. But he adds a little humorous and witty spin to all of his stories. And I just loved it. What did you think about, this was an interesting quote, and I didn't have time to work it in. Tor said, "You should not change yourself for anyone." This is another deep moral, mysterious code because they were, but yet maybe they weren't at the heart, which goes back to your question about the rule book in some way.
Yeah, I think it goes too to this idea of your outward identity versus the core of who you are, because all these characters may have changed their outward self, but ultimately we came back to who they really were. And so I thought that was a really great quote. This book, this is what I love. He talks about big houses, bad families, but also these moral conundrums. And that identity one to me is at the heart of what he's always exploring.
I was really very intrigued when he said, if you pretend you're someone for too long, even an actor, you don't realize you are becoming that person. And I have seen actors being interviewed after they have played a certain part for many, many years, and you almost cannot distinguish them from the part they've played. Have you seen that?
Absolutely.
It is quite interesting. I love that point.
And it could be a good thing, right? You can think in your mind, I am a good person. I'm a this. I'm going to embark on this career. And you adopt that identity and it becomes true. So I don't know, that could go either way. That would be an interesting thing for Alex to explore in a book too.
Okay, Alex, there you go.
All right. Well, I want to tell our listeners about some of our upcoming fabulous authors. We have Victor Mythos with The Silent Watcher, Fiona Davis, The Stolen Queen, Carter Wilson, Tell Me What You Did, Jill Shalvis, Better Than Friends, Mark Greaney, Midnight Black, Andrews and Wilson, Defense Protocol, Marshall Karp, Don't Tell Me How to Die, Brett Battles, writing for Stuart Woods, Golden Hour, Tess Gerritsen, The Summer Guests, Robert Cray, The Big Empty. We got Brian Freeman writing for Robert Ludlum, The Born Vendetta, Robert Dugoni, Hold Strong, and many of those are repeat and actually three-peat authors that are coming back on our show. We just love talking to them, and we know you love them too. So continue to tune in. You can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, on X. We are on TikTok. We are on YouTube. If you search for Bookstorm and Podcast, we should come right up and you can see these fantastic authors. Till next time, listeners, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.